Now to begin, I appreciated how Clerk Karen Takimoto opened the meeting for business Monday night, asking us all to take a moment in silence to acknowledge and appreciate the Indigenous peoples who had lived and stewarded the land where we each live today. We'll talk about land acknowledgements later in this workshop, but I want to begin a little differently today. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat. So, in the chat, and address your comments to everyone. In the chat, write your name first. Don't send it yet. Just write your name. And if you are Indigenous, please share your tribal affiliation if you like. Don't send it yet. And then write where you grew up. Now, some people grew up in 5 or 6 different places. Choose one of those places. Write one place where you grew up. Don't send it yet. And then write the name of the Indigenous peoples who were there before European settlement. If you don't know this, just write, I don't know it. It's not a quiz. So now when you're finished with that, hit enter, and we'll take a few moments to scroll through the chat and see the way we are all introducing ourselves. Well, I love doing this. It's always so interesting to see all of the places on this land where that we know and love, that our families have known and loved, and to also see the names of some of the Indigenous peoples who knew and loved this land long before the arrival of Europeans who came with high hopes, and those who came from Africa against their will and in chains, and from every other place in the world. Our intention is to hold and honor all of our love for this land as we meet today. Now that we've used the chat for this purpose, going forward, we'll ask you not to post comments to everyone in the chat because we all know this can be quite distracting. So here's the plan for today. I'm going to talk about some of my work in Friends Peace Teams as co-director of the Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples program, and give a little background about what led me to this work. At a couple different points, I was planning to have us break into groups of 3 to share thoughts in response to some queries. But the process of breaking from this breakout room into 10 or 15 other breakout rooms is pretty complicated. So I really didn't want us to get all tangled up in technology. So instead, we'll do some journaling and sharing with the whole group together. And then after today's workshop, I'll email a document to all of you with some resources. So to begin, my journey of learning from and collaborating with Indigenous peoples started during the 20 years I lived in Costa Rica. You may know about the Quaker community Monteverde in Costa Rica. That community was founded by pacifist Quakers who decided to move there when Costa Rica abolished the army in 1948. 25 years later, in 1973, I decided to go to Costa Rica for the same reason. I wasn't a Quaker then, but I was a peace activist, and I wanted to learn how people live in a non-militarized society. So that's what took me to Costa Rica. What kept me there was being welcomed by Indigenous communities and people of African descent who became my friends and neighbors on Costa Rica's Caribbean coast. When they learned I was a writer, they asked me to help them write their own histories as unique Indigenous and Afro-Caribbean peoples. I spent the next 20 years collaborating with them to write and publish books based on their oral histories. I learned so much from that experience, but today I want to mention just two things that I learned from the Indigenous Bribri people. These lessons are about the relationship between people and place and the palpable presence of history. So lesson one, the people and the land are inseparable. Bribri are rainforest people. They have no way of talking or thinking about themselves that does not include the forest. They have no way of talking or thinking about the forest that does not include the Bribri. They described the relationship as two sides of a coin. Neither exists without the other. The people and the land are inseparable. Lesson two, history is present in this very moment. When I started doing research with the Bribri for the book they wanted to write, I was working with younger Bribri who spoke Spanish as well as Bribri, but we interviewed many Bribri elders who spoke only Bribri. At the end of our first such interview, I wanted to thank the elder for sharing his knowledge and memories with us, so I asked him how to say thank you in Bribri. Through the translator, he began his reply by saying, "When the Spanish came, I was stunned." He told a long story about the Spanish conquest that I won't repeat today, but I can't tell you how shocking this was to me. There I was, a young, foreign, white woman who had only asked how to say a single word, gracias, and his mind instantly took him back 500 years to when the Spanish came and to everything that followed between his people and the foreigners. The Spanish of the 16th century were as present to him as I was, sitting there beside him. For Indigenous people, history is as present in this moment as the snap of my fingers. Since I've been back in the United States, I've been giving workshops where I ask people to think about our country's history of genocide and colonization and forced assimilation of Native peoples. It's something most of us don't think about very much, and our schools don't teach very much, and our government never acknowledges. I ask people to think about what really happened here on this land, and then think about the Indigenous people in our communities today. What would right relationship with them look like now in our lifetimes? How could we build relationships built on truth and respect and justice and our shared humanity? Many people say, but I don't know any Indigenous people. This might be true or it might not. Indigenous people are not always recognizable in stereotypic ways. But what is true is that many non-Indigenous people don't feel any connection with Indigenous people. That makes it hard to imagine what it would mean to work towards something like right relationship with them. So I wondered, where can we find connection that can help us build relationship? I started thinking about what I had learned from the Bribri about the relationship between people and the land, two sides of a coin, and the relationship between history and the present moment. And I started wondering if we might find common ground between Native and non-Native people in this country by focusing literally on the ground, on the land, and our shared history of the land. I realized I could start by learning my own family's history in relation to the land, and then ask who lived on that land before my family. How are we connected through our shared relationship with the land? How can this connection help us take steps toward right relationship? Linda Hogan, a Chickasaw poet, wrote, there is a way that land speaks. Most of the time, we are simply not patient enough, quiet enough to pay attention to the story. I started listening to the land and paying attention to the story. I'm going to tell some of what I learned and then ask you to reflect on your own stories. My ancestors on both sides of my family came to this country from Germany in the 1840s. They bought land in Michigan Territory and founded a town they called Frankenmuth. The fertile land of central Michigan had supported a very large native population until it was wrested from them by the Treaty of Saginaw. This treaty was signed a couple decades before my ancestors arrived. The territorial governor, Lewis Cass, promised the Chippewa that they could remain on smaller tracts of land in Michigan forever. But then Cass became Secretary of War under President Andrew Jackson, and he was put in charge of enforcing the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This law forced all Native people to leave their eastern homelands and move west across the Mississippi River. Cass broke his promise to the Chippewa and forced most of them to leave. Some of their land became my family's farm. My parents didn't learn this history in Frankenmuth schools. My father and I learned it together by searching the internet for a few hours. What does this history mean for my family? What does it mean to the Chippewa, expelled from Michigan and spread out now across the Dakotas? I don't have clear answers to these questions, but I know that the land remembers. And I know that the Chippewa people and my family are bound together in the story of this land. One way has already come to light. My colleague, Geraldine Dakota, is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in North Dakota. Geraldine and I work together in the Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples program. We had been doing this work for 6 years before we realized that some of her Chippewa people had been removed from Michigan so that my German immigrant ancestors could make farms there. Geraldine and I are related through the land. There is something awesome, terrible, and beautiful about acknowledging this as we work together. So now we're going to take some time for you to journal about your family's experience of arriving to this continent and their relationship to the land where they settled. A couple notes. If you are Indigenous, please write what you know about your people's history on the land at the time of European colonization. And for African Americans, the term settler doesn't apply to people who were brought to this land against their will and then enslaved here. We want to recognize this difference in our families' stories and then ask you to write what you do know about where your ancestors lived and the Indigenous people who were there before or during that time. So here are the queries, and I think John is posting these in the chat. What do you know about your family's immigrant story? Where did they come from? Where did they settle? What did they do there? What do you know about the Indigenous people who had been there before or were there when your family arrived? What happened to them? Where are they now? We're not going to have time for you to write family history here, but please make notes of what you do know and where these thoughts lead you. And we'll just have about 7 minutes for this journaling.
Excuse me, did you mean for this to be entered into the chat or
No,
journal? Just
no, the
write
queries
for
are
your
in
own use.
the queries are in the chat. Just write this for yourself,
All right,
please.
thank you.
Okay, that's about as much time as we have for journaling, and I know it's that was very little time for beginning to think about all of those questions if you hadn't thought about them before. I'd like to take some time now for you to share some thoughts about the questions that this exercise raises for you. We don't have time for you to share your family stories today, but I'd like to hear some of the questions that arise for you. So if you'd, about your families or about the Indigenous people who were living in the place where your families settled. So if you'd like to share some of your questions, the questions that might lead you further in this work, raise your physical hand or your Zoom hand. You can do that by going to, usually to reactions and then raise a hand. And I'll call on you. And we only have, again, about 8 or 9 minutes for this sharing, so please be considerate of others and make your comments brief, but it would be very nice to hear from you. I can't see everybody on my screen, so it's probably best for you to raise your Zoom hand. But I do see Howard. Howard, unmute yourself, Howard.
Sound, okay. Even though, so it may be a little confusing. So just real briefly, the big question for me that comes up when I think this is how thoroughly this has been erased from the history of my family and my state. The only thing that I would have learned up until I got interested in it on my own is there were these, there's a description of the tribes that were there and that sort of thing. And then suddenly they're not there. Mm-hmm. And there's no, when I learned Iowa history back in grade school, that was, there are all these tribes and all these things. And now the settlers came. So I think the erasure of history is what's the big question for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Howard. Galia?
When I was trying to write my story, it was hard to think of, like which pair of eyes to look at. I do have a bit of a Cherokee in me, and some of that story was important with the, but it wasn't well told. So a lot of it, okay, I'll fix it in just a minute. A lot of the story was, yeah, that's right. Howard has it.
Here, sweetheart. Here, let me fix it.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, she was Winnie the Pooh. Excuse us. So some of it is the stories that really weren't carried on, and yet that we've have rumors of things. Like why my grandfather didn't go to school was that he was embarrassed to be half Indian, and he was he was teased and not so it was. But I had these two sides that I don't know much about either one. So,
thank you, Galia. Nice to see that little person there too. Other reflections or questions?
What it makes me want to do, Paula, is after I took your workshop in December, I went and looked up the and found the tribal location for where I grew up, and I wrote it down. And now I can't find where I put it. But what raised for me today was not knowing what tribes were located where my grandparents lived. So that makes me want to go do some of that research.
Thank you, Kathleen. There is a website. I will send that to you in the documents that I'll send you after the workshop. There's a website where that has a fairly good, it's not perfect, but it has a fairly good depiction of where all of the different tribes were at the time of European settlement. So now I'm seeing Larry.
Yes, I have a reflection, and that is that so much of my my ancestors' migration was dependent upon horses. Horses in warfare used to push my ancestors further and further west until now I'm in Texas.
Thank you. And Andrea?
So I grew up part-time in upstate New York, where it was a very noted that the Iroquois Nation was strong in that area, and the names of the towns and the parks and all of that. And then when I was 13, we moved to North Texas, and I don't really recall there ever being any discussion. So it's interesting that depending on where you lived as you grew up, you heard the stories or you didn't. The only remembrance I have was going over to Oklahoma and going to the Native American Museum there in Oklahoma City. Indigenous tribes have always fascinated me, and my family are farmers. So I just, I want to know more. I wonder what their response and reactions were. Were they amicable, or was it, were they thought of as being fierce and needing to be removed? I don't know. It leaves me with lots of questions, so thank you.
In another workshop that I did the other day, I asked people to imagine a conversation between their ancestors and the native peoples who were there at the time that they arrived, and that was an interesting imaginal process. So, Bridget.
Well, first I want to say it's an interesting coincidence today that we're having this workshop. I went to get my second COVID shot, and there was a man there with a T-shirt on about the Chumash Tribal Youth Summit in 1997. So we got to talking, and because I've been out, as Paula, you have, to the Chumash land, and the walk that he was on, and I came on the Save Our Sovereignty walk of the tribes in California in 1999. So it's just kind of interesting that happened this morning before this ever happened today with this workshop. But the first time I did this exercise, I kind of focused on, I recognized that I focused on the people who came here kind of after settlement, after the settlement kind of had already happened. So I think that, and I recognize that might have been a little bit of a move toward innocence for myself, that, oh, well, it was already settled. And so I didn't, they didn't really push anybody out. And anyway, so it's pushed me to do a little bit more research, and I'm excited right now to, anyway, part of my family, they goes way back to even New York and that whole thing of, but then they came to Montana, and it's really interesting because I just recently found a book. So much of our history, as we know, is from the settler, the history books that we've had, that we're, like it was mentioned earlier, where they just go away. This particular book doesn't do that, and I haven't started it yet, but it's the very year that my great-grandfather and moved there, and it talks about what happened with the interaction. So, but speaking of books, I've been reading something called The Empire of the Summer Moon about the Comanches. And I think, and it really kind of explains a lot, I think, why Texas, those of us in Texas and it through the whole Plains area may not really know a whole lot, because there's not a lot, the Comanches, there's kind of this area where there's a lot known on the East Coast and there's a lot known on the West Coast, and through the kind of settled tribes of New Mexico, but not much in the middle. And so it's been really kind of fascinating to be reading this book. And I know that even with that book, there's a lens through which things are told, but I think he's trying not to do it. But it's,
Bridget, I'm going to ask if we can take a couple minutes to hear from Claudia and Denise, because we need to be moving on. Thank you.
Denise has had her hand up for a long time. Perhaps she should go first.
Denise?
Okay, thank you. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and there's a home of the, well, I'm not sure how to say it. I always knew, we always said Lenape when I was growing up, but I've also heard it pronounced Lenape peoples. And there were a lot of place names in the Philadelphia area with Native American origins, including all three of the schools I went to, Tawanka Elementary, Poquessing Junior High, and Neshaminy High School. Home of the Redskins, who was our mascot, and the controversy about that continues to this day. They are actually officially still the Redskins. Back when I was in school, we didn't actually think much about it. If anything, it was a term of admiration for the Native American peoples. That I think that's how most of us at school thought about it, but we didn't know much about them. Like virtually nothing. I kind of remember having maybe one social studies unit somewhere in elementary school, but then quickly forgotten. But I also do remember, you know, Pennsylvania, the Quaker state, Philadelphia, the home of Quakerism in the US. I remember stories about, some stories about William Penn negotiating with the Lenape peoples and in the area, and seeing pictures hanging in places of William Penn meeting with them. And yet I also realized I know absolutely nothing about what happened to them. And I looked it up real quickly while I was journaling and found out that, you know, whatever they were, most ended up through forced migration going to Oklahoma. And that was a little bit of a wow for me. I didn't really think about how those peoples had been by and large forced out of the area. That
Denise, largely through work done by John and others at Pendle Hill, Quakers have established very positive, I would say, relationships with the Lenape, who are still on the East Coast in New Jersey and Delaware. So
really good to know.
There will be ways that you can learn that. And I only can ask Claudia to speak now, but only very briefly, please, Claudia. Questions that arise for you.
It goes back to childhood. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, which is a town of mestizos and white people, about half and half. But the summers were in Indian country up the road in the Mescalero Apache area. And I can remember 68 years ago, the old highway, driving on the weekend so my parents could work at the horse track, and seeing women with papoose boards walking the highway. And then fast forward 30 years, they became wealthy casino owners and a ski resort area. And I still have a house there in Indian country. And it makes me humble when I am there, because I realize they're so fortunate to have the land that is approximately where they always were. And my parents arrived there when I was an infant, and they came from Iowa, and my mother from Tennessee. So they knew about Indians, I'm sure, and had a deep respect for everybody there. They were military. And so the integration of the armed services happened the year I was born, and the trying to be gentle with everyone was something. My father's ancestry was Quaker. It was something that just was put in me by my parents, and it was fascinating to be able to live amongst Indians every summer. Still do when I can get there.
Thank you, Claudia. And if this is a new train of thought for you in thinking about your family stories. I hope you'll continue with that. And as I said, some of the resources that I will be sending you might help in that process. So I'd like to go on now with a little more of my family story, and then we'll do some more writing and reflection in a few minutes. My Chippewa colleague, Geraldine Dakota, and I both live in Boulder, Colorado now. My family moved here when I was 9 years old. We drove into Boulder on Arapahoe Avenue, and soon we were out on hiking trails climbing up to the Arapahoe Glacier. I remember asking my father, "What's an Arapahoe?" In 1859, when miners discovered gold in the Boulder foothills, the Arapahoe people were forced out of their camps in the Boulder Valley. Their peace chief, Nawath, was told to camp on the eastern plains at Sand Creek, and that's where the U.S. cavalry attacked them at dawn on November 29, 1864. 230 people, most of them women, children, and elders, were murdered in what became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Reflecting on this history, the Pawnee attorney Walter Echohawk wrote, "The land can speak to those who listen. There is a bluff overlooking Sand Creek where you can hear women and children crying in the wind." Boulder was one of the training sites for volunteer cavalrymen, and more than 50 Boulder men helped carry out the Sand Creek Massacre. Afterwards, the Arapahoe survivors were forced out of Colorado to reservations in Wyoming and Oklahoma, and that's where most Arapahoe people live today. I didn't learn this history in Boulder schools. I learned it just a few years ago, along with a group of Native and non-Native people in Boulder who started studying it together. We decided to visit the Arapahoe people in Wyoming and Oklahoma and ask them how they remember the Boulder Valley and how they would like to relate to it today. Stephen Fasthorse, an Arapahoe elder, told us, "The Boulder area was the chosen place for the Arapahoe people in a spiritual sense. Our ancestors had a spiritual quest to search for a certain place, and when they came here, they knew they had found it. It was foretold to us by the higher being of life. The Creator has always led our people. Our hearts always yearn for our original homeland. We hope we will be welcomed in this place that we belong to." Since then, our Boulder group has been welcoming the Arapahoe back home in many different ways, gradually building trust and forming relationships. One of our goals is for the city to dedicate land so that the Arapahoe people can be here again in their homeland. So now I'll ask you to do some more journaling about the place where you live today. John is going to put some more queries in the chat, and we'll take about 7 minutes again for this journaling. So the queries this time read, where do you live and worship today? What do you know about the Indigenous people who lived there before European settlement? What do you know about the Indigenous people who live there now? How could you learn more?
So Paula, is this going to be another 7-minute exercise?
Yes, just about that much. Yes. Okay, friends. I know that wasn't very much time, but this is just a little starter for these processes, and I hope that it will be useful to you as a starter if that's where you are. So I'd like you to share now for, again, another about 7 minutes or so, what steps you might take to learn more about the Indigenous peoples in your community or engage with them. So who would like to share thoughts about that? I'm seeing Leda
Yes, Lieda.
Lieda.
I'm struck when I'm trying to learn this stuff. I started with the library, having some knowledge of books written by and about Indigenous people that were very informative from the Northeast, where I came from. So I go to the library. I find 3 books about the indigenous population of Texas. And I check out the one that looked to have the most promise and it was touted as a foundational text. And the presentation it did of these primitive, helpless people was so off-putting. It was like, one of the things that needs to happen is the library needs to get better books.
Yes, and one way that you might engage with Indigenous people in your community is to ask the library to hire them as consultants, pay them for the service that they would provide by offering an appropriate book list for the library to purchase. Other thoughts about ways that you might engage? Eileen.
So I'm very grateful for your work, Paula, and for John and the amazing Pendle Hill series this year on these issues. I think there are a lot of resources among friends. The thing I want to lift up for myself, especially as a climate activist, is how much I was pushed to learn about these issues, and I'm still learning for sure, by the activism of Indigenous people themselves. And I think it speaks to that point about the portrayal of helpless people. I do sense this movement among friends to take initiative to increase our own learning, which is great. But I think there has been a real opening around this, partly because of the really courageous activism of First Nations people, of Indigenous people in the US around their own sovereignty, protecting local waters, and the climate all simultaneously. So following things like the Line 3 pipeline struggle that's happening right now is a way to, it's kind of a twofer, can learn about environmental issues and Indigenous issues at the same time, because it's often that's when people become visible, is when they're protecting the land.
Yes, and also a shout out to FCNL. They have a long history of supporting legislation that is important to Indigenous people, and you can get their Native American newsletter, legislative newsletter, and work through their means to support national legislation. Thank you, Eileen. Shannon.
I live now in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we are on the Trail of Tears. And so we've had the good fortune, actually, of having a Sequoia National Research Center at our university. And what they've been doing is collecting the words and artwork of Native Americans and trying to have a place where in their own words they can express what's happening now. So people might want to look into that. A lot of the things have been digitalized so that even during COVID, you don't have to go in, but you can visit them online.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea.
Well, while I was writing, I thought I would Google the University of Texas, and they do have a Native American Studies department, as probably most universities do. Fortunately or unfortunately, the main way we might get a glimpse of Native American culture is through powwows, although they're kind of commercialized. So interesting that those were the events. I'm also like super excited that our new Secretary of the Interior is an Indigenous person, and I feel like we may learn from our own government now, and that just thrills me to no end that the person who should be handling our land is an Indigenous person. So I'm super excited to see what transpires as a result of that, and feel like there should be some learning there.
Definitely. Thank you, Andrea. Another comment? Erica.
Yes, I have worked for a number of years on a teacher planning book called, now I'm not going to say it right, Planning for Truth and Justice. It's basically for teachers who want to teach about social justice. And each year, the plan book contains dates of various events. In the last couple of years, I do some of the research to put the dates in the calendar. And the last couple of years, I've been focusing on Indigenous dates and events. And through that, I've signed up for getting emails from Indian Country Today, which is a really has a lot of really good information about what's going on with different tribes today, and also another mailing list that does own voices, basically, that lists books that are written by, and particularly children's books, because I'm very interested in children's books, that list books, picture books for written by Indigenous as well.
Thank you, Erica. As I said, I'm going to be sending you some documents after the workshop today that will point you to some lists of resources that are offered by Indigenous peoples themselves. So I'd like to move on to this last segment. In our remaining time, I'd like to talk about land acknowledgements. Indigenous peoples around the world are asking for acknowledgement of their history and presence on the land where we all live and worship today. We heard Clerk Karen Takimoto ask us to do this silently at the start of Monday night's meeting for business. How many of you have heard about land acknowledgement statements? Just show your hands. Many of you, yes, good. How many have created land acknowledgement statements? Again, just show your physical hand. Good, some of you. Many Quaker meetings and other faith communities are doing this now, and it can be a good way to begin to develop consciousness about our role in the colonization of this land. It can be a first step toward developing relationships with Indigenous people in our community. Individuals can also post short land acknowledgements in the signature lines of our email messages. You'll see that I've done this when I email you the resources later today. Families can create land acknowledgement displays inside or outside our homes. Churches, businesses, and government offices can create such displays too. I've seen them in Berkeley and Visalia meetings in California, in Boulder and Fort Collins meetings in Colorado, and Winnipeg meeting in Canada. Southeastern yearly meeting recently approved a land acknowledgement statement, and I'm sure there are others. If you're interested in drafting a land acknowledgement statement for your meeting, take a look at several sets of guidelines developed by Indigenous organizations. I'll email links to some of these guidelines today. For now, here are some pointers, and John is going to put these also into the chat. So first, ask yourself why you're drafting a land acknowledgement. What is your purpose in doing this? If it's just to be cool or woke or because someone else did it, take a step back and reconsider your motivations. 2, learn about Indigenous peoples in your community. Think in terms of past, present, and future. So about the past, what is the history of Indigenous people on this land? How did they interact with the ecosystem and with other human groups? If they were removed, how did this happen? Where and how are they living now? The present, which Indigenous people live in your community today? If there are tribal offices or Indigenous organizations, What do they do? What do they need? How can you support their programs and aspirations? What is their relationship with the land today? And about the future. What actions will you take so that this acknowledgement is meaningful to Indigenous peoples? So those are some questions to get you started if you're interested in doing this work around land acknowledgements.
Paula, let me interrupt for 1 second. In case people don't know, when you're in the chat, those 3 little dots in the lower right-hand ellipsis allows you to save the chat. So if you're slow at writing this information down, just go ahead and save the chat. It'll save it to your device, and then you can have it without having to transcribe it.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I'm also going to send this out to you later today. So in our remaining time, I'd like to invite us into worship sharing. We'll share a screen in a moment and post a quotation for us to reflect on. Feel free to speak out of the silence in response to the quotation or to anything else that arises for you in response to this workshop. We have about 13 minutes. And we have how many people? 27 people. So please keep your comments brief, and we'll close at 11:45. John, go ahead and share the screen with the quotation if you'd like. And please, friends, just speak out of the silence. You don't need to raise your hand now.
I'd just like to offer that when we've seen over the last, I don't know, half a generation or so, that we are gradually, and I think it's a very welcome thing, that we're dissolving the grip that the settler mythology has had in our country in terms of our recounting of our history. We are starting to dissolve a rather toxic kind of common memory. And we haven't quite yet constructed the common memory that we need to have to form that community. And I think that the traditions of the people who were here before Europeans were here are going to be important in constructing that common memory, so that we actually do have a real community. It's going to be a long haul, because we still have to, I think, dissolve that triumphalist narrative of conquest that most of us who are of European heritage grew up with. And the thing that we can hope to replace that with is something deeper and something that comes from the people who have always been here.
I've been in a book club that's reading My Grandmother's Hands, and it's about holding trauma in the body and generationally and such. And so when I think about memory, and so oftentimes I think of it as a kind of in my brain kind of thing, but I'm coming to realize that it's in the body as well. And how do I ever know the pain and trauma that another has had and is holding? I know someone who's now working with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And so I think the best that I can do, while I'll never really have the memory in my body of the trauma, I can listen to the stories. And as I listen, I don't know if I can ever really put myself in the shoes of someone, but I think I need to be able to be vulnerable in myself to allow the pain to inhabit my body to some extent, to have that pain inhabit my body as much as I don't want to.
the spirit of the land is very, very powerful. And I think for me, when I can listen to its voice, I have such a visceral connection, and that I think we can all nurture that. In that, I also think that that is just one phase of it. That certainly understanding the history of the people who loved and lived in the lands that wherever we reside today is really important. And fortunate for me, here in Northwest Arkansas, there are some resources. There is a Native American History Museum just up the road. The Cherokees have a new museum. But I also think that that is something that is another phase, that is another step. But yes, there are neighbors that my next door neighbor is of Cherokee heritage. And so continuing the conversation and together it is a learning process, because she is also just now learning about some of her own history and creating that common memory together. That is a powerful statement. That is something that can take us a long ways. It's a journey that we can do together with the people around us, and that is good.
Friends, we're at the end of our time, and I'm grateful to all of you for joining me today. Thank you to Chris, thank you to John, and to SCYM for the opportunity of taking these first steps in all of our journeys together. I wish you well.